So, good morning and happy Sabbath to you all.
Dobro jutro svima i srećna subota.
Thank you, Pastor Dragan, for your kind invitation.
Hvala pastoru Draganu na ljubaznom pozdravu.
I hope he said something nice about me.
Nadam se da je rekao nešto lepo o meni.
I'd also like to thank Pastor Branko for the opportunity to speak today as well.
Također želim da se zahvalim i pastoru Branku za priliku što mogu danas da vam se obratim.
I know the pleasure of baptizing your son, so congratulations.
Znam koliko je veliko zadovoljstvo krstiti svog sina, tako da čestitam.
The first angel story.
Priča o prvom anđelu.
You may need to turn the lights off so you can see it better.
Morali bi da isključe svetla kako biste bolje vidjeli.
You don't need to see me. I'll smile so you see my teeth. It's okay.
Ne morate mene da vidite, ja ću se smijati da vidite moje zube.
I was invited by the youth of my local church a few years ago.
Pred 2 godine mladi su me pozvali iz moje lokalne crkve
To come and have a talk with them. They used to have talks every Friday evening.
da dođem da razgovaramo. Imali smo te zajedničke razgovore petkom uveče
So they invited me to come and talk about identity.
i pozvali su me da govorimo o identitetu.
I could speak about anything I liked within the topic of identity.
Mogao sam da govorim šta god želim, ali unutar teme identiteta.
So I decided I wanted to talk with them about Adventist identity.
Tako da sam odlučio da želim da im govorimo o adventističkom identitetu.
And I started off by asking them, what is it that makes Adventists different to everybody else?
I počeo sam sa pitanjem šta je to što čini adventiste toliko različitim od svih ostalih.
Somebody said, well, we keep the Sabbath.
Neko je rekao, pa dobro, mi držimo subotu.
I said, that's true.
Ja sam rekao, to je tačno.
But there are other people that keep the Sabbath. There's a whole nation of people that keeps the Sabbath even better than us, so that doesn't make us so different.
Ali postoje i drugi ljudi koji drže subotu, čak postoji čitava nacija koja drži subotu i to dosta bolje nego mi, tako da to nas ne čini nešto različitim.
Somebody said, well, we believe in the second coming of Jesus.
Neko je rekao, pa mi verujemo u drugi Hristov dolazak.
I said, that's true, but most other Christians believe that Jesus is coming again.
Ja sam rekao, da, to je tačno, ali i većina drugih hrišćana isto tako veruje u drugi Hristov dolazak.
And even Muslims believe that Jesus is coming again, so that doesn't make us so different.
Čak i muslimani veruju da će Hristos ponovo doći, tako da to nas ipak ne čini različitim.
So somebody else said, well, we've got Ellen White.
Neko drugi je rekao, pa mi imamo Ellen White.
And that's true, nobody else has Ellen White.
To je tačno, niko drugi nema Ellen White.
But many other people have their religious leaders or prophets, so that doesn't make us so different.
Ali mnogi drugi ljudi također imaju svoje religijske vođe ili proroke, tako da nas i to ne izdvaja previše.
Eventually somebody said, well, we preach the three angels' messages.
I konačno neko je rekao, dobro, mi propovedamo trostruku anđelsku vest.
And I said, okay, very good.
Rekao sam, ok, jako dobro.
So what are the three angels' messages about?
Dakle, o čemu govori trostruka anđelska vest?
And there was silence.
I bila je tišina.
Nobody could tell me what the three angels' messages were about.
Niko nije mogao da mi kaže o čemu govori trostruka anđelska vest.
Eventually somebody said,
Napokon neko je rekao,
we're against Catholics.
mi smo protiv katolika.
I said, no, that's not what they're about at all.
Rekao sam, ne radi se o tome uopšte.
And then we had a really good discussion for the next hour.
I onda smo imali poprilično dobru diskusiju narednih sat vremena.
But afterwards, I went home and I was thinking, I think our young people aren't very sure about their identity.
I onda sam otišao kući i razmišljao sam, mislim da dosta mladih ljudi nisu sigurni vezano za svoj identitet.
But my experience is that many of the older people aren't too sure about their identity either.
Ali moje iskustvo mi govori da isto tako ni mnogi stariji ljudi nisu sigurni za svoj identitet.
So I decided I was going to write 3 sermons on the three angels' messages.
I onda sam odlučio da napišem 3 propovedi vezane za 3 poruke anđela.
And I'm going to preach the first angel's message for you today.
I danas ću vam propovedati o prvoj anđelskoj vesti.
Now before you say, oh no, not that again.
I pre nego što kažete o ne opet to.
Just stay with me. I don't think you will have heard it like this before.
Ispratite me i verujem da ćete vidjeti da niste do sada na ovaj način to čuli.
If I was going to preach on the three angels' messages, it had to be different to what we always hear.
Ako hoću da pričam o troanđelskoj vesti, to mora da bude drugačije nego što ste do sada čuli.
And so I decided I would do 2 things with them.
I odlučio sam da ću uraditi 2 stvari.
2 things that I see Jesus doing all the time.
2 stvari koje sam video da Isus stalno radi.
You see, part of our mission, this is our mission statement as Adventists.
Ovo je izjava o misiji nas kao adventista.
About making disciples.
Tiče se o tome da načinimo učenike.
Preparing people for the second coming of Jesus.
Da pripremimo ljude za drugi Hristov dolazak.
And it mentions specifically the three angels' messages.
I konkretno spominje se trostruka anđelska vest.
But as I travel around Europe and I ask people, how many of you have told somebody about the three angels' messages in the last couple of months?
Ali ja dok sam putovao po Evropi, pitao sam ljude koliko ste često govorili drugima o trostrukoj anđelskoj vesti u posljednjih nekoliko mjeseci.
Almost nobody puts their hand up.
Skoro niko se nije javio.
So most of us do it like this.
Tako da mnogi od nas čitamo na ovaj način.
We will tell people about Jesus.
Reći ćemo ljudima o Isusu Hristu.
Preach the gospel that Jesus is coming again.
Propovedat ćemo evanđelje da Isus dolazi opet.
But the three angels' messages not for us.
Ali troanđelska vest nije deo toga.
So as I was thinking about this, I thought Jesus seemed to do two things when he was teaching people.
I dok sam razmišljao o ovome, mislio sam da Isus radi obično dve stvari kad podučava ljude.
He used summaries and he used stories.
Koristi prepričavanja, sažetke i koristi priče.
So for example, when he was asked, which is the greatest law?
Na primjer, kad bi pitao koji je najveći zakon,
he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Summarized all the 600 laws that they had.
On bi sumirao svih 600 zakona i rekao, ljubi Gospoda Boga svojega svim srcem i ljubi bližnjega kao sebe sam.
In Matthew 7, he summarized the whole Old Testament in one statement.
U Mateju 7 on je sumirao celokupni Stari Zavet u jednu izjavu.
Do to others as you would have them do to you.
Činite drugima onako kako biste želeli da oni čine vama.
Brilliant, because summaries you can just remember very easily.
To je jako dobro zato što možete lako da se setite tih sumiranih izjava.
So how would you summarize the first angel's message?
I kako biste vi onda sumirali prvu anđelsku poruku?
Let's just read it again just so that we remember what it is. Revelation 14.
Hajde da je pročitamo zajedno, Otkrivenje 14.
6 and 7.
6. i 7. stih.
Just read them, go ahead.
Okay. I videh drugog anđela gdje leti posred neba, koji imaše večno evanđelje da objavi onima koji žive na zemlji i svakom plemenu i narodu i kolenu i jeziku. I govoraše velikim glasom, bojite se Boga i podajte mu slavu, jer dođe čas suda njegovog. I poklonite se onome koji je stvorio nebo i zemlju i more i izvore vodene.
So how would you summarize that message?
Kako biste vi sumirali, saželi tu poruku?
This is my summary.
Ovo je moj sažetak.
Judgment is good news.
Sud je dobra vest.
So that's all I need you to remember from today. Judgment is good news.
To je sve što želim da zapamtite danas.
Now,
Sud je dobra vest.
we've got to ask ourselves, why should everybody in Serbia hear that judgment is good news?
Naravno, zapitat ćemo se zašto bi za sve nas u Srbiji ovdje bila to dobra vest, da je sud dobra vest.
In fact, why should everybody in the world hear that judgment is good news?
Zapravo, zašto bi svi u svetu trebalo da čuju da je sud dobra vest?
At least a couple of reasons why.
Postoji barem nekoliko razloga zašto.
One, for all religious people.
Prvi, za sve religijske ljude.
They need to know that judgment is good news.
Oni moraju da znaju da je sud dobra vest.
If there's one thing that makes religious people unsure about their future, it's the judgment.
Ako je bilo šta što čini da religiozni ljudi širom sveta budu nesigurni za svoju budućnost, onda je to sud.
And Adventists in particular are unsure about the investigative judgment.
A adventisti su posebno nesigurni vezano za istražni sud.
So I think religious people, Adventists in particular, need to hear judgment is good news.
Tako da mislim da ovu izjavu posebno treba da čuju adventisti, ali i svi religiozni ljudi, da je sud dobra vest.
But I think also non-religious people need to hear that judgment is good news.
Ali isto tako mislim da i nereligiozni ljudi treba da čuju da je sud dobra vest.
Because if there's one thing that's made many people atheistic, it's the idea there's some big being sitting in judgment over me. I don't want to know.
Jer ako postoji išta što je ljude načinilo ateistima, onda je to ta slika da neko veliko biće sedi na tronu i da čeka da nam sudi.
For example, have you heard of the actor Brad Pitt?
Da li ste čuli za glumca Brad Pitta?
I don't know if you know Brad Pitt, yeah? Okay. He grew up in a Christian home.
On je odrastao u hrišćanskom domu.
And he turned his back on the whole thing.
I okrenuo je leđa svemu tome.
became an atheist.
Postao je ateista.
And he was being interviewed and asked about this.
I intervjuisali su ga i pitali su ga o
And
ovom.
he said, a big question to me was fairness.
I on je rekao, veliko pitanje za mene jeste da li je to fair.
If I'd grown up in some other religion, would I get the same shot at heaven as a Christian has?
Da sam odrastao u nekoj drugoj religiji, da li bih dobio istu priliku za raj kao što hrišćani dobijaju?
Because he'd been taught all his life only Christians will get to heaven.
Zato što su ga čitavog života učili da će
And for
samo
him that
hrišćani ući na nebo.
For him, that was unfair.
I za njega to nije bilo
Have you
fair.
heard of Richard Dawkins?
Da li ste čuli za Richarda Dawkinsa?
An atheistic, one of the new atheists. He's always talking against God.
On uvek govori protiv Boga.
His father was a priest.
Njegovi sledbenici se slažu sa njim.
And I'm not even going to try to, you'd have a hard time translating some of the words here of what he says about God. He doesn't believe in this God.
I ja bih imao problema da vam sve prevedem što ovdje piše, ali reči koje on koristi, on iskazuju to da on zapravo ne veruje u Boga.
There's also, for example, an American footballer named Aaron Rodgers.
Postoji američki fudbaler Aaron Rodgers.
Grew up in a Christian home, became an atheist.
Također je odrastao u hrišćanskom domu i postao ateista.
He was asked why on a interview program.
I pitali su ga isto zašto na jednom
And this
intervjuu.
was his answer.
I ovo je bio njegov odgovor.
I don't know how you can believe in a God who wants to condemn most of the planet to a fiery hell.
Ja ne znam kako možete da verujete u Boga koji želi da osudi većinu planete na ognjeni pakao.
It's a good question, isn't it?
To je dobro pitanje, zar ne?
Because in the end, that's what we're saying to people. Either you believe in God or he's going to burn you up.
Jer na kraju krajeva to je ono što što govorite ljudima. Ili ćete verovati u Boga ili će vas on spaliti u vatri.
So I think both religious people and non-religious people need to hear that judgment is good news.
Tako da verujem da i religiozni i oni nereligiozni ljudi moraju da čuju ovu vest, da je sud dobra vest.
This first angel's message is God's way of saying, let me clear it up for the whole world. Judgment really is good news.
Ova prva anđelska poruka zapravo stiže od Boga koji kaže, dozvolite da vam razjasnim to dobro, sud koji sledi jeste dobra vest.
But remember, I told you there's two things Jesus did. He did summaries and he used stories.
Ali setite se da sam rekao da Isus koristio dve stvari da saopšti svoje poruke. On je dakle sažimao ideje i koristio je priče.
And if you're going to tell the first angel's message, just remember this story from John chapter 8.
I ako želite da govorite o prvoj anđelskoj vesti, samo se setite ove priče iz Jovanovog evanđelja 8. poglavlja.
So turn with me to John chapter 8.
Sa mnom otvorite Jovanovo evanđelje 8. poglavlje.
And we will find 4 reasons why judgment is good news from this story.
I iz ovog narativa mi ćemo naći 4 razloga zašto je sud dobra vest.
Stories are the way in which to tell things.
Priče su zapravo način kako da saopštite stvari.
Our brains are wired for stories.
I naši mozgovi su zapravo ožičeni za priče.
That's what neuroscience tells us today.
To nam čak i neuronauka govori o tome.
The only thing you remember from this sermon are the stories that I will tell.
Jedino čega ćete se sećati iz ove propovedi jesu priče koje vam budem ispričao.
That's why Jesus was constantly telling stories.
I zato je Isus stalno govorio priče.
So this story, I think you know it very well. 4 reasons why judgment is good news.
I mislim da ovo znate jako dobro, ovu priču, 4 razloga zašto je sud dobra vest.
First of all, who is it that's on trial?
Prva stvar, kome se sudi?
You know this story very well.
Znate jako dobro ovaj narod.
This woman taken in adultery, brought before Jesus, and they're saying, she was caught in the act, shouldn't she be stoned?
Dakle, žena je uhvaćena u preljubi, dovedena je pred Isusa i oni kažu, ona je uhvaćena u činu preljube, zar ne bi trebalo da je kamenujemo?
On the surface it seems like the woman is the one on trial.
I na prvi pogled izgleda kao da se ženi ovdje sudi.
But notice verse 6.
Ali primetite 6. stih.
They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him.
Ovo pak rekoše kušajući ga da bi ga imali zašta okriviti.
The one on trial isn't the woman, it's Jesus.
Osoba koja se ovdje sudi nije žena, već Isus.
They're trying to trap him.
Oni zapravo žele da uhvate njega.
Now notice this. This is a central idea in the great controversy that we believe in.
I primetite da je to i centralna ideja velike borbe u koju verujemo.
The big story that covers the whole of the Bible.
Ta velika priča ili narativ koji se proteže kroz čitavu Bibliju.
Someone has raised doubts about what God is like.
Neko je posumnjao kakav je zapravo Božji karakter.
And what God has done is he's put himself on trial before the whole universe.
I šta Bog čini? On samoga sebe stavlja na suđenje pred čitavim svemirom.
So when you read in the beginning of Genesis, it was God and his decision making that was on trial.
I kada čitate početak prve Mojsijeve, zapravo su Bog i njegove odluke stavljene na probu.
When you read the book of Job, it wasn't Job on trial, it was God and his decision making that was on trial.
Kada čitate knjigu o Jovu, nije Jov bio na suđenju, već Bog i njegove odluke.
When you read most of the Old Testament and the way God is speaking through the prophets, it's like he's trying to defend himself because he's the one on trial.
Kada čitate čitav Stari Zavet i proroke, kada se Bog obraća preko proroka, on govori kao da želi da se odbrani, zato što se on zapravo nalazi na suđenju.
And Paul even says the same thing in Romans 3 verse 4, that God will be proved right when he is on trial.
I čak i Pavle nešto slično govori u Rimljanima 3:4 da će se on opravdati zato što je on na suđenju.
And that's why here in the first angel's message when it says the hour of his judgment has come,
zato u prvoj anđelskoj poruci kada kaže i dođe čas suda njegova,
it's not the hour when he starts to judge, it's the hour when he is judged by us.
to nije čas kada on počinje da sudi, već čas kada se njemu počinje suditi sa naše strane.
The first reason why judgment is good news is because God's on trial, not you and me.
Prvi razlog zašto je sud dobra vest jeste zato što Bog ide na taj sud, a ne mi.
And so when you read the book of Daniel, when the books are opened and the judgment scene that's there, there's thousands upon thousands of people there.
I kada čitate knjigu proroka Danila, kada sud seda i knjige su se otvorile i tu ima na hiljade osoba.
Because God is the one on trial, not you and me.
Zato što se Bogu tada sudi, a ne vama i meni.
I think that's really good news.
I mislim da je to jako dobra vest.
It means for religious people, relax a little bit.
Za religiozne ljude to znači opustite se malo.
You're not the one on trial, God is.
Niste vi kojima se sudi, već je
I
to
think for
Bog.
non-religious people, that would be a much better idea for them to realize.
Mislim da bi za nereligiozne ljude to bila mnogo bolja ideja da je oni razmatre.
God's been accused and he's said, okay, let me put myself on trial and make your mind up whether you think I'm good or not.
Dakle, Bog kaže, ok, hajde ja ću sebe staviti, pošto ste me optužili na sud, i vi se odlučite da li sam kriv ili nisam.
Now, I know you're sitting there a little bit uncomfortable. I'm not so sure about this.
I znam da sad dok sedite nije vam baš prijatno i razmišljate vjerojatno, pa nisam baš siguran.
Second reason why judgment is good news in this story.
Drugi razlog zašto je sud dobra vest.
How is it that we are actually judged then?
Kako se onda nama sudi?
Well, look here in verse 9.
Pogledajte u 9. stihu.
You know what happens in the story? They keep pushing Jesus. Come on, give us a decision. And he writes in the ground, as you can. And so he eventually says, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone.
Znate kako ide priča i sada fariseji pritiskaju Isusa, hajde izjasni se, a on dole piše nešto po pesku.
And then verse 9, look at this.
I onda pogledajte 9. stih.
At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there.
A kad oni to čuše i pokarani budući od svoje savesti, izlažahu jedan za drugim, počevši od starešina do posljednjih, i osta Isus sam i žena stojeći na sredi.
Do you notice what they did?
Da li ste primetili šta su uradili?
They judged themselves.
Oni su sudili samima sebi.
Jesus just said something and they judged themselves.
Isus je samo rekao nešto, a oni su sami sebe
They judged
osudili.
themselves as guilty. Whoever's without sin, throw the first stone then. Go ahead.
Oni su sami sebe osudili. Ko je prvi bez greha, neka baci kamen.
And they all made up their own minds about themselves and dropped the stones and walked away.
I oni su sami u sebi odlučili i bacili su kamenje i izašli.
It's really exciting when you look at the idea of judgment in the book of John. Very quickly, follow with me quickly.
Ispratite me brzo. Jako je uzbudljivo kada pogledamo ideju suda u Evanđelju po Jovanu.
You believe what Jesus says. Everybody here believe what Jesus
Da li
says?
svi vi verujete ovdje u reči koje Isus izgovarao?
All right, John chapter 5 verse 22.
Jovan 5. poglavlje, 22. stih.
Notice what Jesus says.
I primetite šta Isus kaže ovdje.
Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son.
Jer Otac ne sudi nikome, nego sav sud dade Sinu.
All right, if I was in a black congregation, somebody would have said amen.
Da sam u crnačkoj zajednici, neko bi rekao amin.
Do you get that? Jesus says the Father judges no one.
Isus je rekao, Otac ne sudi nikome.
And he's given it all to the Son.
I sve je dao Sinu.
Okay, so maybe it's the Son that's going to judge us.
Dobro, onda možda je Sin taj koji će nam suditi.
Go back to chapter 8 and look at verse 15.
Vratite se u 8. poglavlje i pogledajte 15. stih.
Jesus says, you judge by human standards, I pass judgment on no one.
Isus kaže, vi sudite po telu ili po ljudskim standardima, a ja ne sudim nikome.
The Father doesn't judge anybody, he's given it to the Son.
Otac nikome ne sudi i predaje to Sinu.
The Son says, I don't judge anybody either.
Sin kaže, ni ja ne sudim nikome.
Okay, all right, let me just see.
U redu.
You're a tough congregation.
Teška ste publika.
All right, you all know John 3:16, right?
Svi znate Jovan 3:16, al tako?
For God so loved the world,
Jer Bog je tako zavoleo svijet,
that he gave his only begotten Son,
da je dao svog jedinorodnog Sina,
that whoever believes in him shouldn't perish but have everlasting life.
da kogod veruje u njega ne pogine, nego da ima život večni.
If you keep reading,
Ako nastavite da čitate,
verse 17,
stih 17,
God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him.
Bog nije poslao Sina svog na svet da sudi svetu, nego da se svet spase kroz njega.
Notice verse 18, whoever believes in him is not condemned.
Primetite 18. stih, koji njega veruje ne sudi mu se.
But whoever does not believe stands condemned already because he's not believed in the name of God's one and only Son.
A koji ne veruje već je osuđen, jer ne verovao u ime jedinorodnog Sina Božjeg.
And then verse 19.
I onda 19. stih.
This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil.
A sud je ovaj što videlo dođe na svet i ljudima omile većma tama nego li videlo, jer njihova dela behu zla.
All that God does is say, let me send some light there and see how they react to my Son, the light.
Bog je samo rekao, hajde da im pošalje malo svetla i da vidim kako će oni da reaguju na mog Sina koji je
And the
svetla.
way we react to him, that is how we judge ourselves.
I način na koji mi reagujemo prema njemu jeste način na koji mi zapravo sudimo sebi.
In other words, your future is in your hands.
Drugim rečima, vaša budućnost je u vašim rukama.
It's not in the hands of some celestial court that may decide for or against you. It's up to you. You want to be there? You can be there.
Drugim rečima, nije u rukama nekog tamo nebeskog suda koji će možda odlučiti, možda neće odlučiti da vi budete spašeni, već je u vašim rukama. Vi možete biti tamo i ne morate.
It's so much easier to just let a person judge themselves by what they see happening with Jesus.
Mnogo je lakše staviti osobi u ruke sud, da ona sudi sebi na osnovu toga što uradi Isus
I remember I
Hrist.
was giving some Bible studies to a group of people one time when I was the pastor at Newbold.
Sećam se kada sam bio pastor u Newboldu, držao sam određenoj grupi biblijske časove.
And the way I would do the Bible studies is I would get each student to read a part of a passage of the Bible and we would discuss it.
I ja bih to učinio tako što bi svakog studenta zamolio da pročita određeni pasus i tekst iz Biblije i onda bismo o tome pričali.
This one time we were looking at the story of the woman at the well.
I jednom smo gledali iz Jovana 4. poglavlja priču o Isusu i ženi kod studenca, kod bunara.
And then at one stage, this one young lady, she read where Jesus said to her, yes, what you've said is right. You've got 5 husbands and the one you're living with now isn't your husband.
I jedna mlada dama je primetila da je Isus rekao te čuvene reči, dakle da, i ti imaš 5 muževa i onaj sa kojim sada živiš i on ti nije muž.
And as she read that, she said, oh,
I kad je pročitala to, rekla je,
But we carried on with the Bible study.
Ali nastavili smo sa proučavanjem.
Afterwards, when we were finished,
Kada smo završili,
I asked her just to stay behind just for a little moment.
pitao sam je da ostane na kratko malo.
And I asked her, what was that reaction when you read that verse?
I pitao sam je zašto takva reakcija kad si pročitala taj stih.
And she said, because she wasn't a Christian, but she was part of the Bible study, she said, well, I live with my boyfriend.
I ona, pošto ona nije hrišćanka, ali je deo tog proučavanja i rekla je, pa ja živim sa svojim dečkom.
We've just bought a house together.
Mi smo kupili zajedno kuću.
And Jesus says that we're not actually married, so I've got to go and tell him that we got to get married.
A Isus kaže da mi zapravo nismo u braku i onda morat ću da odem da mu kažem da mi zapravo
Now,
nismo
I
u
hadn't
braku.
said anything about that whatsoever in the Bible study.
Ja nisam rekao ništa vezano za to tokom ovog proučavanja.
But she judged herself based on what she'd seen Jesus say, that, oh, maybe living together isn't the same as being married.
Ali ona je zapravo sama sebi presudila kad je videla Isusove reči i rekla je da živjeti sa nekim zajedno nije isto što i biti u
And
braku.
that's the second reason why judgment is good news, because we judge ourselves.
I to je drugi razlog zašto je sud dobra vest. Mi sudimo samima sebi.
Your future is in your own hands. If you choose Jesus, you've chosen life. Rejoice.
Vaša budućnost je u vašim sopstvenim rukama. Ako ste izabrali Isusa Hrista, vi ste izabrali život i onda treba da se radujete.
I think Christian people need to realize that we judge ourselves.
Mislim da ljudi koji su hrišćani treba da shvate da mi sudimo sebi samim.
Because one of the saddest experiences I ever had
Jedno od najtužnijih iskustava koje sam imao
was visiting a church member in the hospital
jeste kada sam posjetio jednog člana crkve u bolnici
who was dying and they knew they were dying.
koji je bio na samrti i znao je da umire.
And she looked at me with fear in her eyes.
I ona me pogledala sa strahom u očima.
And she said, Pastor, do you think God will judge me okay to be in heaven?
I ona me pitala, pastore, da li misliš da će mi Bog presuditi tako da ću ja ipak biti u raju?
Imagine you're going to close your eyes in the sleep of death.
Zamislite da ste na pragu toga da zatvorite svoje oči i da spavate snom smrti.
And you're still unsure whether or not you'll be there?
A i dalje niste sigurni da li ćete zaista biti tamo.
It's heartbreaking.
To slama srce.
That's why judgment is good news, because if you've chosen Jesus, you've chosen life.
Zato je
It's
sud
okay.
dobra vest, jer ako ste izabrali Isusa Hrista, izabrali ste život.
And I think non-Christian people would warm to that idea so much better, that their destiny is in their own hands.
I mislim da ljudi koji nisu hrišćani daleko toplije će primiti ovu vest da je njihova kompletna sudbina zapravo u njihovim rukama.
The third reason why judgment is good news in this story.
Treći razlog zašto je sud dobra vest.
What is
u ovom
God's
narativu.
main objective?
Šta je Božji glavni cilj?
You notice in the story that Jesus wrote in the dust a couple of times.
Primetili ste da je Isus se sagao i da je pisao po pesku.
And we're told here in verse 6
I ovdje
and verse
piše
8 that that's what he did a couple of
u
times.
6. stihu, u 8. stihu da je to činio par puta.
What was he doing?
Šta je on tu radio?
Now, most commentators say that he was most likely writing their sins in the dust.
Većina komentatora govori da je najverovatnije pisao njihove grehe u prašini.
Notice that, writing their sins in the dust.
Primetite to, pisao je njihove grehe u prašini.
So if they saw their sin, they could just go, oh, I don't like that one, let me get rid of it.
Dakle, ako bi vidjeli svoj greh, mogli bi samo da kažu, meni se to ne sviđa i mogli bi da ga obrišu.
And notice, this is God writing with his finger.
A primetite da je to Bog koji piše svojim prstom.
And God has written with his finger a couple of times in stone.
A Bog je pisao par puta u kamenu svojim prstom.
When he wrote the 10 commandments, never to be erased.
Kada je napisao 10 zapovesti da se nikad ne obrišu.
When he wrote on the wall at Belshazzar's feast so that they would never forget it.
Kada je pisao na zidu u Valtazarovoj palati tokom gozbe kako nikada ne bi zaboravili.
He could have written their sins in stone, but he writes it in dust so that they could, because he doesn't want to embarrass even his enemies.
I on je mogao da ih napiše u kamenu, ali ih je napisao u prašini kako bi ih oni mogli obrisati, jer nije želeo da osramoti čak ni sopstvene nebe.
So that we would realize that God is in the saving business, not the condemning business.
Kako bismo mi shvatili da je Bog u ulozi spasitelja, a ne u ulozi onoga koji nas
And Jesus was
osuđuje.
always doing this, trying to save people, not condemn people.
I Isus je uvek to činio, on je pokušavao da spasi ljude, a ne da ih osudi.
When he was invited to the home of Simon the Pharisee,
Kada je bio pozvan u dom Simona, fariseja,
and a sinful woman was washing his feet,
i žena grešnica je prala njegove noge.
and Simon started to think some very negative things about Jesus.
I Simon je počeo da razmišlja jako negativne stvari o Isusu.
Notice, Jesus just told him a story to let him know, I know what you're thinking.
I primetite da je Isus jednostavno mu ispričao priču da bi mu nagovestio,
But he
ok, znam šta misliš,
He didn't embarrass him in front of all of his dinner guests.
ali nije ga osramotio pred svim njegovim gostima.
Because Jesus is in the saving business, not the condemning business.
Jer je Isus došao da spašava, a ne da osuđuje.
And notice how he treated Judas.
I primetite kako je se odnosio prema Judi.
Why was he so gracious towards him? Because Jesus is in the saving business, not the condemning business.
Zašto je bio tako ljubazan prema njemu? Zato što je Isus onaj koji je spasitelj, a ne onaj koji osuđuje.
And you know, we should have understood this a long time ago,
I znate, trebalo je da ovo razumemo jako davno,
because there's a whole book in the Bible called Judges.
jer postoji čitava knjiga u Bibliji koja se zove knjiga o sudijama.
Is it called Judges in Serbian?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Judges, yeah?
Book about judges. we call
Yes,
it. Yes.
okay.
that's
And here's this job description of a judge.
I evo ga opis jednog sudije, kako njegov posao treba da izgleda.
Judges 2 verse 16 it says, you can just translate it, it should be
Okay.
fine.
U sudijama drugo poglavlje, 16. stih,
The Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of the raiders.
kaže da je Bog podizao sudije koji bi ih spašavali ili izbavljali iz ruku njihovih neprijatelja.
Judges were saviors, not condemners.
Sudije su bili spasioci, a ne oni koji osuđuju.
That's why Jesus was writing in the dust, because he's trying to save them, not condemn them.
Zato Isus piše po prašini, jer pokušava da ih spasi, a ne da ih osudi.
And I think that is so gracious of Jesus.
I mislim da je to tako blagodatno od
I
Isusa.
don't know about you, if it was me,
Znate da sam ja na njegovom mestu
and I know that they're trying to condemn me,
i da znam da oni pokušavaju mene da osude.
I would have said to them, now the law says you should bring both the man and the woman. So where's the man?
Ja bi im rekao, znate kako, ipak zakon kaže treba da dovedete i muškarca i ženu. Gde je muškarac?
They would have been so embarrassed they would have had to run away.
Bili bi tako osramoćeni da bi morali da pobegnu.
But that's not Jesus.
Ali to nije Isus.
He's even trying to save his enemies as well.
On čak pokušava da spasi i svoje neprijatelje.
Imagine what religious people would be like if they realized they were not under condemnation.
Zamislite kakvi bi bili religiozni ljudi kada bi shvatili da nisu pod osudom.
One of the things that bothers me every time I see when they do research among non-Christians about what they think about Christians.
Ono što me muči jeste svaki put kada vidim da se radi određena anketa ili istraživanje o tome šta non-Christians think about Christians.
Yes.
Šta nehrišćani misle o nama hrišćanima.
One of the top 3 is always that Christians are judgmental.
Jedna od 3 stavke koja je na vrhu te liste jeste da su hrišćani osuđivački nastrojeni.
And I think that's because most of us think and we worship a God who we think is always judging us.
A mislim da je to slučaj zato što mi smatramo da obožavamo Boga koji u svakom trenutku nama sudi.
Maybe if we worshipped a God who wasn't judgmental, we wouldn't be judgmental either.
Možda kada bismo obožavali Boga koji nije osuđivački nastrojen, možda ni mi ne bismo bili
I think
tako
for
nastrojeni.
non-religious people this would be very good news.
Mislim da bi za nereligiozne ljude ovo bila jako dobra vest.
That God is not trying to condemn people.
Da Bog ne pokušava da osudi ljude.
And even if you choose against him, he's not going to bully you into choosing him either.
I čak i ako izaberete da idete mimo njega, da ste protiv njega, on vas neće zbog toga maltretirati.
The fourth and final reason why judgment is good news in this story.
5. i posljednji razlog zašto je sud dobra vest u ovoj priči.
What does his posture say about him?
šta njegovo držanje govori o njemu.
When you think about the final scene, just Jesus and the woman, how do you imagine it in your mind?
Kada razmišljate o ovoj posljednjoj sceni, kada samo Isus i žena stoje tu
I've seen the way many artists portray it. The woman is down there in the dust and Jesus is saying, I no longer condemn you.
Video sam većinu tih umetničkih predstava da je žena dole u prašini, a Isus iznad stoji i kaže više te ne osuđujem.
But when you read the story, you get a completely different impression.
Ali kada čitate narativ, dobijate skroz drugačiji dojam.
Would you all stand for me, please?
Možete li svi da ustanete sad?
It's not a trick question, just
To
stand.
nije trik pitanje.
So when you read the story, it actually says,
Kada čitate ovaj narativ, ono što zapravo piše,
notice it says in verse 2,
primetite u drugom stihu.
at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered round him and he sat down to teach them.
A ujutro opet dođe u crkvu i sav narod iđeše k njemu i sedavši učaše ih.
Jesus was most likely sitting on the steps of the temple.
Isus je najverovatnije sedeo na stepenicama od hrama.
This is the way they used to do it in Jesus' day.
Ovako su to radili u Hristovo vreme.
The teacher would sit and everybody would stand.
Učitelj bi sedeo, a svi ostali bi stajali.
I think it's a brilliant idea.
I mislim da je to sjajna ideja.
Nobody would ever fall asleep in my sermons again.
Niko ne bi više zaspao na mojim
Pastor,
propovedima.
throw out all the chairs and only you sit.
Pastore, izbacite sve klupe i samo
Because that's what they
stojite.
did in Jesus' day. He sat, you keep reading it, he sat down to teach.
I ako nastavite da čitate,
And then
pisalo
everybody's
je
got to
da
start
bi on
doing this
seo.
to try and see, right? That's what they did.
I onda ne bi bilo niko ko
And
bi
then we're told
pokušavao da vidi.
from his sitting position, he bends down and just writes in the dust.
I onda on je iz svog sedećeg položaja se savio i pisao po prašini.
And he says, okay, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone, and carries on writing in the dust.
I on je rekao u redu, ko je prvi bez greha, neka baci prvi kamen i nagao se i nastavio da piše po
And
prašini.
the final scene, because the woman is placed right in front of Jesus,
I posljednja scena, pošto je žena stavljena tačno ispred Isusa,
the final scene has Jesus sitting at the feet of the woman.
u toj posljednjoj sceni zapravo Isus sedi kraj nogu ove žene.
Imagine that.
Zamislite to.
The creator of the universe sitting at the feet of a sinful woman.
Tvorac univerzuma sedi kraj nogu jedne grešne žene.
That's absolutely incredible.
To je zapravo jako neverovatno.
But it's unsurprising. It's not surprising
Ali nije iznenađujuće.
because I believe God is the most humble being in the whole universe.
Jer verujem da je Bog najskromnije biće u čitavom univerzumu.
Because we're told the greatest in the kingdom is the servant of all.
Jer nam je rečeno da je onaj koji je najveći u Carstvu nebeskom sluga
And if
svima.
God, who is the greatest, must be the servant of all.
A ako je Bog najveći, onda on mora da bude sluga
And I
svima.
think that's why the angels love to worship and serve him, because he's always serving them.
I ja verujem da zato anđeli vole da ga obožavaju i da ga slave i da mu služe, jer on uvek služi
And
njima.
that's why on the night when he was betrayed, bending down, washing feet, wasn't something unnormal for Jesus. It was, this is how he is. He's the most humble being in the whole universe.
I zato u onoj noći kada je bio izdan, kada se savio da pere noge svojim učenicima, to nije bilo ništa neobično, to je
Isn't
bilo
that the
sasvim
kind of
normalno.
God you'd like to worship?
Da li biste voleli takvog Boga da obožavate?
Isn't that the kind of God you could go and tell other people about?
Zar nije to Bog o kome biste voleli da govorite i drugima?
Couldn't you go and say, you know what, judgment really is good news? Let me tell you a story.
I možete reći, znate, sud je jako dobra vest,
And just
dozvolite da vam
tell this
ispričam.
story of the woman caught in adultery.
I ispričajte im priču o ovoj ženi koja je
With a
uhvaćena
God
u
who would sit
preljubu.
at your feet and wash your feet to lift you up.
O Bogu koji je sedeo kraj vaših nogu i oprao vaše noge kako bi vas podigao.
Please sit down.
Možete sesti.
Let me just finish off with a quote from Ellen White. I'm sorry I should have showed you this before, but we'll take it sentence by sentence.
Voleo bih da vam samo na kraju jedan
Perhaps
citat
my
od Ellen White
favorite quote from Ellen White.
Pročitam, ovo je moj omiljeni citat od Ellen White.
From Christ's Object Lessons.
Iz Hristovih očiglednih pouka.
Notice she says it's the darkness of misunderstanding of God that is enshrouding the world.
I primetite šta ovde piše, da je ta tama koja okružuje svet dolazi od pogrešnog shvatanja Boga.
When you get overwhelmed and you think this world is such a dark, horrible place, it's because of misunderstanding of what God is like.
Kada ste nekako savladani svim time što se dešava oko vas i mislite kako je sve mračno i tamno, to je zapravo zato što pogrešno razumete karakter.
She goes on to say, men are losing their knowledge of his character.
Ona kaže dalje da ljudi gube znanje o njegovom karakteru.
God's character has been misunderstood and misinterpreted.
Božji karakter je pogrešno shvaćen i pogrešno protumačen.
Then she says, at this time, a message from God is to be proclaimed, a message illuminating in its influence and saving in its power.
I ona kaže, u ovo vreme Božja poruka treba da se oglasi svima, poruka koja rasvetljuje po svom uticaju i spašava po svojoj moći.
At this darkest moment, now a message is to be proclaimed. And what is this message?
I u ovom najtamnijem trenutku ta poruka treba da se oglasi svima. Koja je to poruka?
His character is to be made known.
Njegov karakter, on kao osoba treba da se obznani.
Let people know what God is really like.
Recite ljudima kakav je Bog zaista.
And she finishes it by saying, the last rays of merciful light, the last message to be given to the world is a revelation of his character of love.
I ona kaže o tome da ti posljednji zraci milostive svetlosti, posljednja poruka milosti, odnosno blagodati koja treba da se saopšti svetu, jeste otkrivenje njegovog karaktera ljubavi.
Go and tell the world this good news.
Idite i recite svetu ovu dobru vest.
The good news that judgment is good news because
dobru vest o tome da je sud dobra vest. Zbog toga
God's on trial, not you and me.
Bog je na suđenju, a ne vi i ja.
That we can control our own destiny by our own choices.
Da mi možemo da kontrolišemo svoju sudbinu svojim izborima.
That God's main objective is to save, never to condemn.
Da je Božji glavni cilj da nas spasi, a ne da nas osudi.
And that God is always willing to humbly serve us, to lift us up.
I da je Bog uvek voljan da nam ponizno služi kako bi nas uzdigao.
That's a message I think this world is dying to hear, the good news about what God is like.
I mislim da je to poruka za koju ovaj svet čezne da je čuje, kakav je zaista Bog.
You know, in my mind's eye, I imagine catching up with this woman later on.
Ja u svom umu zamišljam kako ću se kasnije susresti sa ovom ženom.
Can you imagine if you had been able to talk with this woman and ask her, what does she think?
I da li možete da zamislite u svom umu kako bi bilo da vi razgovarate sa ovom ženom i da je pitate šta ona misli?
Is judgment good news?
Da li je sud dobra vest?
I think she would have been jumping up and down with joy.
Ja mislim da bi ona skakala gore dole radosna.
And she'd be saying, judgment is good. Of course judgment is good news.
I pitala šta, sud je dobra? Pa naravno da je sud dobra vest.
Jesus got both himself and me off. I'm alive. What else do you think? Judgment is good news.
Isus je izvukao i sebe, ali i mene. Dakle, ja sam živa. O čemu govoriš? Naravno da je sud dobra vest.
And then he sat at my feet and set me free.
I onda je seo kraj mojih nogu i oslobodio me.
I'm going to tell everybody that I'm going to worship this man for the rest of my life.
Ja ću reći svima da ću ja obožavati ovu osobu do kraja svog života.
I think that's a story worth telling.
I mislim da je to priča koju vredi ispričati.
Amen.
Amin.